I were to ask any of you today to recommend whether it would be better to provide substance abuse treatment to alcoholics and addicts or to lock them up in jail, I'm pretty sure, or at least I'm hoping, the majority of you would say that of course we should provide them treatment. But there's usually an emphatic but, because alcoholics and addicts often behave in unsavory, sometimes criminal ways. And yes, criminal behaviors should be addressed by the justice system. But if these behaviors are a manifestation of the addiction, they won't be corrected by simply locking the individual up. Addiction is a disease, not a choice. It improves with treatment, not punishment. Today I'd like to challenge the opposing belief that addiction is simply a behavioral problem, and challenge the idea that the Department of Corrections is correcting those that suffer with addiction in any way. Like other mental illnesses, addiction is a health condition, not a criminal behavioral problem. Although addiction is considered a brain disease by the scientific and medical community, not everyone agrees. Critics insist that substance abuse is essentially a bad habit formed by poor choices and insufficient willpower. They argue that addiction is not at all a disease but a behavioral problem. And how do we respond to bad behavior? With punishment or remediation, depending on how you view prison, because the Department of Corrections has become the go-to for these so-called behavioral problems. However, there is extensive scientific evidence that indicates that addiction is a brain disease. From the National Institute of Drug Abuse, in their article, The Science of Drug Abuse and Addiction, The Basics, quoting directly, they write that brain imaging studies from people addicted to drugs show physical changes in areas of the brain that are critical for judgment, decision-making, learning, memory, and behavioral control. It's those compulsive and destructive behaviors that society is reacting to, labeling the behaviors bad or immoral or criminal without considering them as a reflection of a brain disorder, a type of mental illness. And even if we are considering it a mental illness, which has lost some of its stigma, addiction is one of the least tolerated. From a study done through Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, to directly quote, it was found that not only did respondents have significantly more negative opinions about those with drug addiction than those with other mental illnesses, but there were much higher levels of public opposition to policies that might help drug addicts in their recovery. This is from a study called Public Feels More Negative Toward People with Drug Addiction Than Those with Mental Illnesses, again by Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. To me as a substance abuse counselor working in the profession, the results from these studies are disappointing and frustrating, and yet not all that surprising, because I often hear critical opinions such as, they need to just get themselves together, or they brought this on themselves, or it's a lifestyle choice. But it's not a choice. Just as the person with schizophrenia cannot will the voices away, and the individual with bipolar disorder is not choosing to go into an acute manic episode. Once the disease of addiction has manifested itself, one can no longer just pull him or herself together and stop. Perhaps even more difficult to accept is the chronic nature of addiction. The individuals suffering from the disease and their families often do not get the support and comprehensive services they need to cope with a chronic relapsing disease. One of the least tolerant of the addiction's chronic nature is the justice system. For example, for those on probation for possession of an illegal substance or drug paraphernalia, even if they're court-ordered to do substance abuse treatment, with relapse, probation is too quickly revoked and people are sent to prison, during which time they're not offered any further treatment. There are also too many people on probation for minor crimes, such as loitering or petty theft, that had their probation revoked for continued use of alcohol or drugs, where again, they're sent to prison where they're offered no kind of treatment whatsoever, despite the fact that they were incarcerated directly because they could not stop using alcohol or drugs. This is not just my observation from experience working as a substance abuse counselor. It is commonly reported that more than half the state prisoners have a drug or alcohol use problem, and yet only about 10% of them receive treatment, This can be found in many academic research articles, but I'm quoting from author Gary Zarkin. He wrote about the study replacing prison terms with drug abuse treatment and how it could save billions in criminal justice costs. We don't show the same intolerance to relapse with other diseases. Here you can see a chart from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. It's a comparison of relapse rates between drug addiction and other chronic illnesses. Quoting directly from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, relapse rates are similar to those for other well-characterized chronic medical illnesses such as diabetes, hypertension, and asthma, which, like addiction, also have both physiological and behavioral components. And please note that actually hypertension and asthma have higher relapse rates than drug addiction. So when referring to these other medical conditions, in other words, for the person with hypertension, for example, the medical disorder was caused by a mix of genetics and lifestyle behaviors, such as a diet high in calories and saturated fats, obesity, and a sedentary lifestyle. Even after diagnosis, even after medical complications due to noncompliance, or relapse into old behaviors that exacerbate the medical condition, the medical team will continue to work with this patient with hypertension for the rest of his or her life, often spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in continued medical treatment. By the way, it's not that expensive if we were to invest that much time into continued treatment for people who suffer from addiction. There's another very important point. A consequence of criminalizing addiction is that we are overwhelming the state and federal prisons' capacities nationwide. Quoting from Mortimer Zuckerman's article, Get a Little Less Tough on Crime, since 1980, the prison population has grown by about 800%, while the country's population has increased by only a third. The origin of this unseemly record is in our panic about the explosion of addiction in the early 1980s. Now, this is not an old article. He just refers back to the 1980s, but it was actually published in May of 2014. The author goes on to insist that nobody can pretend any longer that these congested facilities are remedial institutions. Exactly the opposite, and I'm in agreement. Quoting from Mortimer's research, more than 40% of ex-convicts return to prison within 3 years of release. In some states, recidivism rates are closer to 60%. I can only repeat my own observations. As a substance abuse counselor, I myself have many examples of receiving new clients who report they have never received treatment while in prison, despite that they had convictions such as felony drunk driving and probation for drug possession revoked because they couldn't stop using their drug. So were then sent to prison and still did not receive treatment. I used to suspect it was because many of my clients were from a very low socioeconomic status. Many have a low literacy level, and maybe they weren't adequate at advocating for themselves, nor could they obtain good representation. But apparently no one is exempt. There's an article written by Maya Salovitz. It's called The Case of Cameron Douglas, Prison is Not Rehab, Say Addiction Experts. Cameron Douglas, the son of famous actor Michael Douglas, who has apparently suffered with addiction for years, was sentenced for 5 years imprisonment for drug possession and distribution in 2009. While incarcerated, he was caught with heroin and Suboxone. The latter is a drug that's used to treat opioid addiction. The judge's response was not to order the obviously needed institutional treatment, but to extend the prison sentence by 4.5 years, describing Cameron Douglas's behavior as reckless, disruptive, and non-compliant. Addiction is a disease, not a choice. It improves with treatment, not punishment. The Department of Corrections is not serving the needs of those suffering with addiction. If there are criminal behaviors such as drunk driving, robbery, or violent acts against others, yes, the criminal justice system needs to intervene. But if these behaviors are a manifestation of the disease must be addressed with appropriate treatment, or nothing will change. no one gets better without treatment.